Hello, I'm David Forrester, local historian and author. These are the memories of a nonagenarian lady from Dorchester. The following story of Ivy Gale comes from my interview with Ivy in 2014. Sadly, Ivy passed away in 2015, but her memories live on. These are the memories of Ivy Gale. When Ivy was born in 1917, war was raging across Europe, but in Fordington all was quiet. Ivy lived in the centre cottage of a terrace of 3 cottages, 10 Standfast Road. This no longer exists. Ivy told me our cottages were 1 room up and 1 room down. In the end cottage lived 2 ladies. However, our centre cottage was somewhat more crowded. I was the middle one of 7 sisters, 2 of whom died when they were quite young. We all lived in 1 room downstairs, and then at night we all slept in 1 room upstairs. Us girls all in 1 bed, 3 across the top and 2 across the bottom. We continued these sleeping arrangements until 2 of the girls reached puberty and started their periods, at which time the girls were moved out, one to stay with Granny and the other to stay with Dad's sister. The cottages we lived in were served by 1 outside tap and 1 outside toilet between the 3 cottages. Fortunately, there were only 2 single ladies in the other cottages. At the time of the interview in January 2014, Ivy was the last surviving of the children, the others all having died. At the beginning of her life, when Ivy lived in Standfast Road, the road ran along what is now called King's Road, opposite the Methodist Chapel. The houses faced the bank of St George's graveyard. Here a great number of my family were buried, said Ivy. They are all up one side of the path. The caretaker at the cemetery at the time was Mr. Walton. Ivy's grandmother was a Voss and lived in Holloway Road. Her other grandparents, the Gales, lived in Coker's Froom. As we will hear later, this part of her extended family became a very important lifeline. Jane, my mother, managed all the cooking in the 1 downstairs room, heating pots over an open fire. They had no range or aga. Once a week, a long bath was brought in from the yard. Kettles and pots were boiled, and the whole family bathed in turn, Ivy recalled. I guess you wouldn't have wanted to be last in the bath. My father, John, was a steamroller driver for Edison's, a big company based in Wareham Road, Fordington. So he worked away a lot. He would tow a shepherd's type hut behind his machine in which to spend the night. Every 3 weeks I would travel with my mother Jane to take Dad clean clothes and food. I was a dad's girl, really. Edison's had contracts to build roads all over Dorset. John's machine had a device fitted to the side which would tear up the surface of the old roads. This would then be cleared away and new surface was laid down and rolled in. Unfortunately, when I was quite young, my father had a bad accident, said Ivy. He was in hospital for a year. At this time he also developed a weak heart. This, as we can imagine, put an enormous burden on Ivy's mum, as John never really worked again. In those days there was no social security. You were on your own. Jane took in washing and worked at the union to make ends meet. Though Ivy never went hungry. We never ate dry bread. There was always something to put on it, Ivy stressed. We can see from this that Jane was a good manager and a very hard worker. However, they were all fortunate to have a wider family to lean on. This must have been one of the factors that kept the whole family safe from the workhouse, Ivy told me. On a Friday, I would go down to Edison's with my little trolley to meet the carrier. and he would bring a sack of vegetables from Granny and Grandad Gale. These vegetables would get us through the week. Always sewn into the top corner of the bag would be a 6-penny piece, a huge help in those days. Ivy remembered once a week my sister and I would visit the Mole Institute, where the ladies of the church would hand us 2 long loaves of bread. We couldn't have managed without the ladies of the church. This fact is interesting, as John was a Salvationist, very strict, who never smoked or drank. Jane, who was actually Welsh, was a Methodist and refused to change to the Salvation Army. It's clear that none of this stood in the way of being given help by the church at the Mole Institute, now sadly demolished. From a very early age, Ivy discovered that, like her mother, she had a voice. At the age of 5, I was sitting on the stage at the Corn Exchange with a basket of flowers, singing, "Will you buy my pretty flowers?" I have always had a voice and sang in choirs, but now my voice is gone. I can't sing anymore. Despite living in abject poverty, Ivy's mother was intent that they should all have clean clothes and a starched pinny. When Ivy was 4, she and her sisters were fishing with a jam jar by the mill when she was pushed over by a bigger boy and floated off down the river, supported by the air trapped under her starched pinny. The current was quite fast, and Ivy was carried along until spotted by a sharp-eyed woman from the big house on the corner, who pulled her out before she was swept off through the hatches. Ivy, of course, cannot remember this, but the story was related to her by her parents. Ivy told me, "I attended St George's Infant School at the top of High Street from the age of 3. Sometimes I had a problem, as I couldn't pull my knickers up properly. They buttoned up the side. I couldn't tie my boots either, so occasionally I would have to run off down Holloway Road, knickers around my ankles, boots in my hand, to Granny Voss, who sorted me out." When aged 7, I moved on to the gasworks school in Isom Way, said Ivy. When we needed coke, I would take my little trolley to school, so that on the way home I could take a sack of coke with me. Ivy started work very early. Times being so hard, nothing much would be expected at Christmas, Ivy explained. However, we never went without. We each had a black stocking. This would contain an orange, apples, perhaps a pear that had been stored, and a piece of fruit cake. There was always a silver threepenny piece sewn into the top. These, like much else, were supplied by the grandparents. This is a tradition that still lives on in the family, continued first by Ivy and now her daughter. One day, a shopping trip nearly turned into a disaster. The lady from the big house asked Ivy to get some shopping for her. She was given a list and a half-crown piece, 2 shillings and 6pence, more money than Ivy had ever held in her hand at one time. Ivy ran off excitedly. Unfortunately, the coin slipped from her hand and down a nearby drain. Everyone helped. The grill of the drain was lifted off, and then someone was lowered in head first to root around in the sludge at the bottom of the drain. Eventually came the cry of delight. The coin was found. One can only imagine the relief for everyone involved, especially Ivy, who for the rest of her life remembered the joy she felt when the coin was found. During Ivy's school days, many of the children suffered from diphtheria. A number of the parents thought it came from using the swimming baths at Gray's Bridge, which were then closed, Ivy explained. Basically, the baths were fed with river water and the cows were in the river upstream, probably a health hazard which still existed when I was a child. At this time, however, the health scare was polio. Ivy, along with many others, went down with diphtheria and was put into the isolation hospital in Herringston Road. These were old timber-built buildings with tin roofs. Ivy remembers it well. The isolation hospital was totally overcrowded. The beds were side by side with hardly any room to move. I think I was about 10 at the time, said Ivy. In my own childhood, these buildings had become the TB isolation hospital. By the age of 8, Ivy had moved to Fordington Hill and was busy doing lots of jobs for her mother. Twice a week I would take my little cart loaded with clean washing up to Max Gate for the Hardys. My 2 sisters, Nellie and Bessie, were at this time working for Thomas Hardy, one as a chambermaid, the other in the kitchen. Thomas Hardy would often see me as I walked through the garden with my little cart, but never once spoke or gave me a smile of recognition. Mrs. Hardy, however, always made a fuss of me and would give me a piece of fruit from the fruit bowl. Life was quite hard for the 2 girls in service, and the days were long. Mr. Harvey was prone to following the chambermaids around and would often remove coal from the fire and put it back in the coal scuttle, Ivy explained. When it came to meal times, he controlled how much the staff could eat. The cook was not allowed to have the remaining joint. He would carve the staff a slice of meat each, then it was locked away. Then came that fateful day, the 11th of January 1928, Ivy told me. I was now aged 11 and arrived as usual with my little cart bearing the clean washing. As I approached the house, my sister ran to meet me. "You can't come round to the kitchen," she said. "You'll have to come around the side. The old man has died and they are in the kitchen with him on the table." Well, Ivy continued, as it turned out, Thomas Hardy's heart was removed there and then and put into an OXO tin. The gardener took it to the undertaker, who put it in a casket which was taken to Stinsford Vicarage until it was put into the grave. Once the OXO tin was empty, Mrs. Hardy made the gardener dig a deep hole in a far corner of the garden and bury the tin. Mrs. Hardy told the gardener to dig deeper, deeper. I could still point out where the tin was buried, said Ivy. Presumably this was to stop anyone taking it as a memento. Ivy added, "The cat never did eat his heart. That was a fallacy." On occasions, Ivy had been approached by the Hardy Society and asked about Thomas Hardy. However, as she told me at the time of the interview, I would not talk to them, as there was not too much good to be said about him, and I didn't think they were looking for bad news. From my own point of view, I was not surprised by this comment, as I was once introduced to his last housekeeper, whose only word on Thomas Hardy, when I asked, was, "Miserable man." Having heard this from 2 different sources, one has to wonder if perhaps he was totally different to his friends and acquaintances than he was to those who worked for him. By the time Ivy was in her teens, the Gales had moved to Fordington Hill, near the builder's yard. Ivy remembered, "With my sister I used to go out to dances. There were 2 rules, to be back by 9 o'clock, and we must not dance with soldiers. Well, the second rule, of course, we often broke, as we loved dancing with soldiers. One drawback to this was that the soldiers wore white belts, and the white came off onto our dresses while dancing close. So a routine developed. Before returning home, we would stand outside the shop on the green, using a window as a mirror, and rub the white off our dresses and inspect each other before entering the house." John, like many fathers, had a soft spot for the girls and would often overlook lateness. As our house was built up against the builder's yard, it made it possible to get over the low wall onto the lid of the water butt and in through our bedroom window, said Ivy. Thus it was possible for the girls to get home a little late and creep into the bedroom. Ivy said her mother would quite often say, "Those girls are late again, John." Good old Dad, having heard us creep in, would say, "Oh no, Jane, they're upstairs in bed." After a while, however, we took advantage, coming in even later. John decided this had to stop. He removed the lid from the water butt. Grinning, Ivy went on to say, "We arrived home and made our usual entrance. However, as I stepped over the wall onto the water butt, I went deep into the water, there being no lid on the butt. Having replaced the lid, we scrambled into the bedroom. I then had no choice but to wring out my clothes as best I could and hide them under the clothes ready for the wash. Next morning, their father said, 'Lot of noise out the back last night.' Ivy replied, quick as a flash, 'That must have been old Tom the cat again.' However, they knew the game was up. Ivy married a 20-year-old soldier, William Hayne, from Yeovil when she was 18 and a half. However, her hard life was not over. My husband was in bomb disposal and was damaged by shrapnel in his neck. At the time, I was a sergeant driving a lorry which carried a barrage balloon. I had my 21st birthday at this time, but didn't really know I was 21 until a card arrived from my mother. Despite my husband's injuries, he worked for many years as a bus driver until he was unable to work due to his health. He eventually went blind, and I had to nurse him. He lived until he was 90, but I continued to nurse him at home for many years. Finally, he went into hospital for the last year of his life, as I was not allowed to have him at home. This made me very sad, as they didn't think I could look after him at my age, but I so wanted to. When Ivy was 96, some people arrived to present her with the Voluntary Service Medal. They explained that all the men had received medals for their service in the war, but the women had not. This was an effort to put this oversight right. However, of course, far too late for many who had long since passed away. Ivy made one thing very clear during the interview. She stressed that, despite living just around the corner, we were not allowed down into Mill Street, as it was considered far too rough for young girls. I hope you've enjoyed this trip into the past, hearing Ivy's story. One cannot help but feel how lucky we all are today. Even those who think they are having a hard time have lived through nothing compared with the Gale family. There really was nowhere to turn other than the support of your own family in those days. However, as we have heard, on occasions the church stepped in to make life more bearable. Interestingly, I've been working with the Mill Street Housing Society, recording the memories of people who lived in or knew relatives in Mill Street. Eventually, with the help of the society and the publisher Roving Press, I was able to produce a book, Mill Street, Thomas Hardy's Mixen Lane, based on these memories. Also available is my book, Fordington Remembered. I hope you've enjoyed these stories from the past. I am David Forrester. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.